Our society, American politics especially, is one where you see change happening because you have ideas that are existing in the undercurrent that then a political leader or an organization or multiple people get behind and they suddenly bring it to the fore. Welcome, friends, to episode 80 of The Hopeful Majority. We made it to episode 80, a round hold number, so I want to give you a special monologue episode today, and it's about a new counterculture that is emerging on America's college campuses. Now you say, Manu, what do you mean there's a counterculture emerging on America's college campuses? All I've known about when I think about college campuses is polarization, it's division, it's protest, it's anxiety, it's intolerance, ideological rigidity. I mean, you Google college campuses, all you get is information and news about things going upside down, students being unable to have productive conversations. And as you know, the Hopeful Majority, for those of you that are new to the show and joining it, every Monday on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content, we talk about how we can actually build a new majority of people, a new temperament to enable us to have open-minded, productive conversations, to be able to listen to people that are different than us. I know, right? What a novel concept. So there's a counterculture emerging. Now you say, well, if the norm on college campuses is one of constant protest and ideological rigidity and echo chambers, then what is this new counterculture? Well, I want to tell you a story. I'm going to take you back to February 2nd, 2017. It's a day that changed the trajectory of my life. It was 2 or 3 months after President Trump's first inauguration. Now, I'm a freshman at UC Berkeley, and there's a speaker that came to campus, and the speaker's name was Milo Yiannopoulos. He was invited by the college Republicans. Now, if anybody knows anything about politics, Milo was known as this sort of provocateur figure that would show up to campuses and say a bunch of crazy things, rile up people, and then leave. So I was walking past a cafe, right? And inside this cafe, this window was broken in, and it said, CNN, UC Berkeley students protest free speech. I take for a second. I look back and say, what do you mean CNN, UC Berkeley students protest free speech? I'm at UC Berkeley right now. It's crazy about that moment. I hear helicopters flying overhead. I hear shouting in the distance. Now, this is Berkeley, so protest is par for the course, right? But this was actually different. This would be one of the largest protests in Berkeley's history. It cost the university hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages. And what's crazy when I was watching that CNN screen through the cafe was that the reporter that was filming that with CNN was standing right next to me. And that was the breaking of the fourth wall. The coverage that entire night and the next day about UC Berkeley and colleges in general was that people can't have productive conversations, that there's a lot of ideological echo chambers, that we've built a culture, what many called a resistance culture, a culture that was resistant to open inquiry and conversations, that we met disagreement with violence. And yet, that next day when I walked on campus, there was a different reality. And that reality was not one of violence and protest. It was also not one that showed that all of the students were in support of protesting the speaker. It was a reality where the majority of students that were showing up wanted to help their campus community. They wanted to understand why we met speech with violence. They also wanted to understand why these people invited the speaker. Was this really a productive person to invite? Is this how you have dialogue? There was a more nuanced layer, right? The word nuance, if you've been a listener of the Hopeful Majority, that's a word that follows the show everywhere it goes, because that's the key. There's a layer of nuance below the headlines. Now, this layer of nuance was interesting because it showed me that the majority of people on campus believed in being open-minded. Majority of people on campus were interested in listening to people that were different than themselves. And yet you were at this moment where the coverage, the headlines, what we were hearing and seeing was violence, right? That UC Berkeley students cannot have conversations. And so a week later, myself and some friends, we helped launch this chapter called Bridge Berkeley, which was in partnership with chapters at Bridge Notre Dame and Bridge Colorado Boulder, became this organization called Bridge USA. The idea was that we were building spaces for conversation, for people to listen to each other. It was a student-led movement. And if you're a listener to the show, usually I'm wearing the Bridge USA hoodie, but today I've got another hoodie on because I got to show people that, yes, I have different clothes and I have different hoodies. Believe it or not, that's some of the comments we get. Putting that aside for a second, Bridge USA, we started this organization. The idea is that we're going to start building a culture of listening, of open-minded conversation. Now, how does this connect to there being a counterculture? Well, I think over the last 3 years, things are starting to change on college campuses, and I think they're changing in broader society. I'll read you two data points. So there's an organization called More in Common and Constructive Dialogue Institute. They released a report that said that 94% of students agree that we should listen with an open mind. 94%. What? Because when I look at the news, that's not what I hear. What I hear is there's there's ideological echo chambers on campuses, and yet this data says that 94% of students should listen with an open mind. Organization called FIRE reports that 61% of faculty surveyed said a university professor should be free to express any of their ideas or convictions on any subject. Really? Because that is different than what I've heard. More in Common report also says 90% agree that no matter how different we are, we can understand each other's experiences by listening and empathizing. So there's this interesting reality where what people actually feel, the majority of people on a campus that want to be able to listen and talk and engage, their majority temperament is not reflected in the reality of the news, because the perceived reality is that you've got these people on campus that prevent us from having open-minded conversations. And I actually think there's something happening here. And what's happening is that I think there's a new counterculture that is challenging the dominant norms of the last 5-6 years in American society. If 2017 to 2023 marked an era of resistance on a college campus where the dominant norm was one of meeting people that are different than us with anger, with contempt, if the norm was that we have to shut out people that disagree because our views have to be held safely, I think things are starting to change. And I'll say, as an organization, Bridge USA, that has college students from across the country, we got college chapters across the country. Just this past semester in 2024, during the election, peak election period, we hosted and we had over 10,000 students attend Bridge USA conversations, these conversations with differences, with people that are ready to debate. And that was, by the way, more than the entire academic year of 2023 to 2024. There's a new counterculture. And that counterculture cherishes people that want to listen to each other. It's a counterculture that believes in open-mindedness. It's a counterculture that believes that we have to respect ideological diversity, that if we can engage with people that are different than us, not necessarily to compromise or for some kumbaya reason, but to actually, as our United States motto says, e pluribus unum, to actually be able to create a world in which meeting different ideas causes us to create a better idea. E pluribus unum means out of many, one. I think this counterculture is one that is ready to explode, because this counterculture is one that cherishes fundamental norms that most people believe in. In the 60s, you had a counterculture. With President Trump, you had a counterculture that challenged dominant norms in our politics. With President Obama, you had a counterculture that challenged the way that the Democrats approached politics. With Reagan, you had a counterculture that became the norm. Our society, American politics especially, is one where you see change happening because you have ideas that are existing in the undercurrent that then a political leader or an organization or multiple people get behind, and they suddenly bring it to the fore. I believe that most people in our society at this moment are actually tolerant. I believe whether they're MAGA red or progressive blue, whether they're centrists or people that exist across the political aisle, the fact is that I think most people want to live in a world in which we can actually talk to each other, where we can engage across lines of difference, where we can actually listen to people that are different than us, not for the purpose of giving up our views, but to understand why. I think most people are exhausted, man, about how toxic our politics are, by how tribal our politics are. You can see past episodes. I mean, we had on, for example, General Stanley McChrystal, who led Tier 1 Army and Navy units during the global war on terror, during the peak of it. And he's talking about how we need to build an ethic that responds to the majority of people in our moment right now. I think that most people that listen to the show, the reason why you listen to the show is because you're ready for a new majority. It's a majority that I call the hopeful majority, a majority that taps into those fundamental beliefs that if we cannot move past our inability to have disagreements, then we cannot have a democracy. The reason why I call bridge building a counterculture, because many people listening to this might say, well, bridge building just sounds like the norm, right? That we should have conversations. What's counterculture about that? Well, here's what's counterculture about that, because it is now actually the resistance. It is more courageous to meet protest and violence with the dialogue than it is to counter protest. I believe we live at a moment when people that come together and host people that are very different than themselves in a charged political environment are actually doing God's work. They're actually doing the hard work of saying, hold on, at this very divided moment where everybody else is telling you to go scream and fight and jump into your own little tribe and defend it at all costs, I'm going to actually go out there and host a conversation. That's countercultural. It is challenging the prevailing norms of the moment, because those norms of the moment right now are driving us to a political arms race to no end, where we've prioritized politics over problem solving, where we've prioritized political wins over people. And when we live at a moment where we are prioritizing politics over people, we are fundamentally giving up the fact that the people that lose in a highly polarized environment are everyday normal people, whereas the people that win are the grifters, the conflict entrepreneurs, what I call the outrage industrial complex, which is a whole episode we did, I think about 4 episodes ago. It was called How to Resist the Outrage Industrial Complex. I say all of this because I think we have to start elevating and institutionalizing this new counterculture. I think it's bubbling up. I think people are ready for a new temperament. They're ready for a breakthrough. And if not on America's college campuses, then where? I think college campuses can be the bright spot. They can be the beacon for what is possible for broader American society, because what happens on a college campus does not stay on a college campus. The last 7 years have shown us that, whether it was critical race theory, DEI, whether it was free speech policies, campuses and colleges have always been America's political battleground. They've been one of those battlegrounds that have been contested. And I think there's a new ethic and a new temperament that is core to the university's mission from the start, and that is the temperament of intellectual inquiry, listening to people that are different than ourselves. And I think we have an opportunity to elevate this counterculture at this moment. Because again, if we don't, then I don't think we pull off this incredibly ambitious experiment called American democracy, where you've got 330 million people, all of whom look differently than each other, with different backgrounds, different identities, heavily armed, trying to make it work. And that's ultimately the reason why we do this show every Monday. Today was a special episode. It was a monologue again, instead of an interview. In fact, the last episode, we featured some people that are leading this counterculture, our Columbia chapter presidents and student leaders at Columbia University that hosted Israel-Palestine conversations. It's what I call the Mount Everest of dialogue, and they did this with partnership with the College Debates and Discourse Alliance. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, and I want to tell you about this counterculture because it's time to uplift it. If you're sitting and listening to the show and you're saying, man, I agree with this hopeful majority thing, you're actually in the majority. That's the secret, and that's how we elevate this counterculture. So with that, I appreciate you listening. I appreciate you taking the time. Like and subscribe, because we're going to build this hopeful majority together. If you're on Spotify and Apple, give us a review every Monday. Wherever you listen to your content, we're going to come at you live, the hopeful majority, and we're going to continue having some amazing conversations as we go through 2025. Let's build this counterculture. I'll see you next week, friends.